You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
Let me take you back to that infamous scene. My brothers at the cleaners, the moment in the Social Network movie that haunts every founder's mind. You know the one. The betrayal, the tension, the realization that dreams can be taken away in the blink of an eye. But here's the kicker. It's Hollywood. Dramatized, polished, compressed for maximum sting. Even the book that inspired the script had its accuracy questioned. And the main consultant? Eduardo Saverin himself, right in the middle of suing Mark Zuckerberg. So, how much is real and how much is just for show? Now, you might be thinking, does it even matter if it's accurate? The truth is, for a generation of would-be entrepreneurs, including Meth, was our first peek behind the startup curtain. We met Peter Thiel, heard about venture capital, and saw how shares and ownership could make or break relationships. The movie planted ideas some true, some twisted into the collective imagination. But what really happened behind the scenes of Facebook's founding? That's where myth meets messy reality. And that's the story we're unpacking today, step by step. Think about Mark Zuckerberg for a second. How do you see him? For most Americans, according to a 2021 Forbes survey, the image is pretty unflattering, often disconnected from how they even feel about Facebook itself. Let's pause. Why is that? Is it because of privacy scandals? Or is it because Jesse Eisenberg's twitchy, cold performance in the Social Network just stuck in our minds? Hollywood is a perception engine, and perception shapes reality. It's what psychologists call the availability heuristic. The more vivid or recent an image, the more it colors our beliefs. Now, you might ask, isn't this just about entertainment? But for founders, the difference between perception and reputation is everything. Investors, partners, even employees are influenced by what they see and hear. So what actually happened between Mark and Eduardo? Was it betrayal or just business? Let's dig into the facts, not the fiction. Because understanding the difference between narrative and numbers is the first lesson every entrepreneur needs to learn. Let me tell you a story about the first big Facebook lawsuit. The Winklevoss twins, yes, those Olympic rowers claimed Mark stole their idea for a campus social network called Harvard Connection. Here's where it gets technical. Mark agreed to help them, then allegedly stalled progress while secretly building his own version what became the Facebook. The emails documenting these delays, they're real. They were made public during the lawsuit, and Facebook's lawyers didn't contest them. But years later, leaked instant messages showed Mark's intent to gain an edge. This is what lawyers call bad faith. It's a crucial legal concept, acting with the intention to deceive or disadvantage another party. The lawsuits got messy. ConnectU, IdoHub, cross-suits, malpractice claims against law firms, the legal labyrinth was endless. It wasn't just about stolen code, but about valuation, equity, and what's known as consideration in contract law. In the end, judges ruled the twins had to accept their original settlement, no second chances. The lesson? In startups, what you sign is what you get. There are no do-overs, no backseats. Now, you might hear people say, don't share your startup idea, they'll just steal it. But that's missing the point. The social network's real lesson isn't about secrecy, it's about execution. Here's a technical term, founder market fit. It means having the right people with the right skills, not just the right idea. Facebook's edge over ConnectU wasn't just time and JIT, was that the founding team could build, launch, and iterate without relying on outsiders. Let's play out a hypothetical. If the Winklevosses had found a coder as invested as Mark, would they have won? Maybe, maybe not. But execution, the ability to turn vision into productice, what separates the dreamers from the unicorns. So next time you're tempted to guard your idea like gold, ask yourself, do I have the team to actually make it real? Because in the end, the marketplace rewards those who build, not just those who brainstorm. Let's zoom in on Eduardo Saverin, supposed victim in this saga. Hollywood paints him as the loyal friend, betrayed by ambition. But what was his real role in Facebook's early days? Fact. Eduardo was wealthy, well-connected, and had business acumen that Mark needed. He was made CFO, with about 30% ownership. But technical term alert, cap table. That's the spreadsheet tracking who owns what in a startup hand from day one. It set the stage for conflict. Eduardo invested money, paid server bills, and even incorporated Facebook as a Florida LLC structure that's notoriously bad for tech startups seeking investment. Meanwhile, Mark and Dustin moved to Palo Alto to code day and night, while Eduardo stayed in New York working on another venture. Now, you might be thinking, shouldn't loyalty be enough? But startups run on contributions, not just contracts. If a co-founder isn't in the trenches, resentment builds and investors notice. Saverin's story is a cautionary tale. Titles and percentages mean little if your role isn't clear and your commitment isn't total. Now enter Sean Parker and Peter Thiel, two names that changed Facebook forever. Sean, fresh from Napster, brought Silicon Valley street smarts. Peter Thiel, PayPal co-founder and part of the PayPal mafia, added credibility and cash. Here's a tech term: convertible note. It's a loan that turns into equity later, often at a discount. Thiel's 500-0 convertible note gave him a foot in the door and sent a signal to other investors that Facebook was legit. But this influx of expertise and money also exposed the problem. Eduardo's 30% stake looked outsized for someone barely involved. VCs call this dead equity ownership held by someone not adding value. Imagine you're a new investor. Would you want to fund a company where a third is owned by someone on the sidelines? That's why Mark, Dustin, and Sean started plotting. The wheels of restructuring began to turn. And with Thiel's convertible note and Parker's vision, the groundwork was set for the shakeup that would define Facebook's future. Let's get technical for a minute. The switch from a Florida LLC to a Delaware Corp was more than paperwork. It was a strategic move that changed everything about ownership and control. As an LLC, Facebook was a partnership, with ownership defined by agreements, not shares. But a corp issues stock, and that's where dilution comes in. When new shares are created for investors or employees, everyone's percentage shrinks 7 if their number of shares doesn't change. Here's the setup. Mark convinces Eduardo to transfer his ownership to the new corp, but with a twist, Eduardo signs away his voting rights and agrees he's not an employee. Now, Mark is the sole director, and the bylaws, think of them as the company's constitution, give him sweeping control. Now, you might ask, isn't that unfair? But in the world of startups, structure is king. If you don't know what you're signing, you're at the mercy of those who do. So, the stage was set for what would become one of the most notorious dilutions in tech history. Here's where the real drama unfolds. Mark, as sole director, starts issuing millions of new shares, mostly as stock options, to reward active employees and, critically, to create a stock option pool. That's a technical term for shares reserved to attract and retain talent. But this pool was much larger than normal, and it served another purpose: diluting Eduardo's stake. Remember, with a corp, creating new shares doesn't require approval from all shareholders if the bylaws allow it. Eduardo, no longer an employee, wasn't eligible for these new options. His ownership percentage plummeted from nearly a third to under 10% in one swoop. And because Peter Thiel's convertible note hadn't yet converted to equity, he wasn't affected either. You might say, didn't Eduardo see this coming? The truth is, most founders don't. They're so focused on building the dream, they overlook the fine print of mechanisms that decide who wins and who watches from the sidelines. This was a textbook example of legal but ruthless founder dilution, move both admired and reviled in startup lore. So what happened after the dust settled? Lawsuits flew, accusations piled up, but ultimately Eduardo and Facebook reached a settlement. He was reinstated as a co-founder, but the damage, financial and personal, was done. When Facebook went public, Eduardo's remaining stake was about 5%, making him a billionaire on paper. Mark kept 29%. But here's a twist. Eduardo renounced his U.S. citizenship and moved to Singapore, a country with no dividend tax. That's tax optimization, a strategy high net worth individuals use to minimize tax liabilities. You might wonder, was it worth it? If you measure by money, maybe, but reputations don't recover so easily. Hollywood's version of events lingers, painting Mark as a schemer and Eduardo as a victim. The real takeaway? In startups, friendships and fortunes can be lost in a paragraph of legalese. The law might side with the clever, but history remembers the hurt. So, before you sign or settle, ask yourself, do you know what you're really giving up? Because the numbers never tell the whole story. Now for the big question. Who was right? Was Mark a calculating genius or a ruthless backstabber? Was Eduardo naive or just unlucky? Aaron Sorkin's script is brilliant because it leaves us with that ambiguity. It's designed to make you judge, to pick a side. But the real startup world isn't black and white. It's filled with gray areas where ambition collides with loyalty and legal strategy trumps sentiment. Consider this. In business, fiduciary duty means acting in the best interest of the company, even if it means tough decisions. But what about moral duty to friends, to partners, to the people who believed in you first? Now, you might say, I'd never do that to my co-founder. But when billions are at stake, the calculus changes. The social network isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a mirror. So, as you launch your own venture, remember, the choices you make today will shape your legacy, not just your net worth. Be clear, be fair, and above all, know that the true story is always more complicated than the movie.